Some 4 years ago, I was sat over there as a member of the audience in a debate about austerity. A few years later, I was Toby Young's seconder in a debate about grammar schools. Well, tonight I'm over here. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Kafurio Pater, and I will be your chair for tonight. As you might probably know, there's another debate going on tonight. Some hoo-ha about the next Prime Minister. But you've definitely made the right choice being here tonight. With all that's going on in the world, it's very easy to find topics for these debates. What does come with some difficulty is choosing the wording. Tonight's debate is about the state of the news media. We started off with a focus on fake news. Then we pivoted to the BBC, before finally deciding on this. This House believes that the mainstream mass media has had its day. Speaking for the proposition, we have Mary Bonsu, who's a law and French student at the University of Oxford. I know Mary from our time at Fortismere Sixth Form, where she would often challenge me and others in our politics classes. She first made her HLSI debut in the debate on citizens' income. Tonight, she too joins us on the stage. For the opposition, we have Grace Volante from Edinburgh University. Grace is currently studying history and classics. She too has previously spoken at the HLSI. When asked her plans for the future, she simply said, making a difference and answering questions. Well, hopefully some questions about the media will be answered here tonight. Each speaker will have 12 minutes to make their case. At the 11th minute, I shall ring my bell, which should signal the end of conclusions, or the time to start concluding your arguments. At the 12th minute, I will ring my bell twice, and hopefully they'll sit down immediately. If not, I will ring my bell 3 times, summoning the guards to drag them off the stage. Hopefully it's not going to come to that. We then move on to hear from our 2 seconders, Yasmin and Kane, who I'm going to properly introduce later on. After which, we shall hear from you, the audience. After that, both of our speakers will give their closing arguments. It's always nice to see where everyone stands at the start of the debate. So can I start with a show of hands if you agree with the motion? If you agree that the mainstream mass media has had its day, please raise your hand. Okay. And those who disagree? Wow. No comment. We'll repeat this exercise later at the end, but for now, our first speaker from the opposition, Grace Volante.
Good evening. My name is Grace Volante, and I'm going to argue against the motion that the mainstream mass media has not had its day, where the mainstream mass media are traditional sources of news and entertainment, like television broadcasting newspapers, often termed the fourth estate. The upshot of my argument will be that the mainstream mass media continues to play an indispensable role in society, and that while its roles in entertainment and national discussion may be challenged by newer media, it retains its primary roles for the public and for the functioning of democratic society. It is going to take significantly more erosion of the influence of the mainstream mass media for it to have had its day, because the wider societal significance of what is traditionally conceived as being the mainstream mass media cannot be underestimated. Firstly, while some forms of cohesion, like political or national ones, may be in question during the Brexit process, a time of uncertainty and present a dichotomy, the mainstream mass media still provides the forms of public cohesion that remain, being solely responsible for the airing of nationally significant events like royal events, sporting events, and clearly the ultimate unifying national event, the Great British Bake Off Final, which was the most watched television programme in the UK in 2015, with 16 million plus viewers. In viewing these unifying and magnetic events, viewers are forced to turn away from newer media and to turn to their traditional television channels. Turning to new media like Twitter to discuss such programs only illustrates the power that the mainstream mass media still has in servicing the things that people spend the most time talking about. Until Netflix airs The Royal Wedding or the World Cup semi-finals, it may be popular, but it will not be as important as the mainstream mass media because of its responsibility for the national events with the most impact and the most viewership, which communicate further ideas than just entertainment. Secondly, as long as our society is structured in the way that it is, in principle, the mainstream mass media cannot have had its day. Indeed, the Fourth Estate has an unparalleled role in our current form of democracy that new forms of media cannot challenge and that recently dipping viewing figures cannot erode just yet. Gregory Shire embodied this idea in Lapham's Quarterly, writing that the faith in the press as the guardian of truth, the watchdog of power, the foundation of democracy, lies at the heart of the liberal imagination of the West. As such, the Fourth Estate reflects what is going on to the public, especially what is going on among those in high places. It is the body in society that allows citizens to exercise their democratic rights well informed. In doing this, the Fourth Estate holds the government to account by publicising its actions and holding them responsible, defending the public and their interests and exposing abuses of power. It is no surprise then that Walter Cronkite stated that freedom of the press is not just important to democracy, it is democracy. In ancient Athens, democracy worked because its citizens were informed in the assembly of the propositions for law and action, which all that were present discussed and voted on there and then. Democracy, as it has re-emerged, however, requires information on a different scale, because not all voters are present to hear the same information, and there are now executive and legislative institutions with actions to account for. So the mainstream mass media is a crucial component of democracy, providing citizens with the necessary information to politically participate at all. As long as the mainstream mass media retains this function and cannot be replaced in this, it will not have had its day. But isn't this idealized and romantic? This is an important criticism to address, and I'm actually beginning to sound like a phooey, which is always a bad sign. So let's examine the practice of this principle that the mainstream mass media is a mirror to reality. Once you think about your experience of this in your life, you might object that the mainstream mass media did not ensure that the citizens of this democracy were well informed about Brexit. Their partisan ramblings and selective reporting seems to mean that the press does not mirror reality, but crafts a picture according to personal preferences, contributing to mistrust of news sources. Moreover, television broadcasting companies have been accused of straying from their pledges to neutrality in reporting on Brexit and domestic politics, evidenced in that the public are beginning to have opinions on whether these neutral sources support Brexit. A YouGov poll of February 2018 found that 27% of those polled thought the BBC was anti-Brexit, 13% that ITV News was anti-Brexit, and 18% thought that Channel 4 was anti-Brexit, with between 40% and 60% in the don't know category for these three news sources. Ideally, according to their intentions, these sections of polled citizens should not exist at all. However, the recent political conduct of the mainstream mass media has not led to its demise, partly because, if the press represented a polemic form of partiality, this was only mirroring the climate in which politicians were speaking, and in this way, the press has continued to mirror reality. The difficulties of reporting apparently neutrally in such a charged environment is repeatedly highlighted by journalists, and people with either opinion are always more likely to see threats from the other side through media like the press. For example, the left-wing Owen Jones has accused the BBC's Andrew Neil of expressing right-wing sentiments while doing his job. But the right-wing think tank Civitas has accused the BBC of underrepresenting pro-Brexit figures. Varied accusations like this demonstrate that those in the political world are prone to seeing the side that they are afraid of seeing in broadcasting companies which have pledged impartiality, and indicate the true difficulty of representing both sides of a debate to anyone's satisfaction. In the words of a Los Angeles Times editor, if both sides equally think you're doing a crappy job, maybe you're not. Maybe you're doing what you're supposed to do. Moreover, opinionated and especially tabloid journalism should not be shocking and is an inevitable aspect of the freedom of the press that is equally as valued as the ability of the press to report in the first place. To cite some wise words from my father, it is in fact the responsibility of a citizen of democracy not to digest all the information they receive, but to actively engage with it and to attempt to distinguish between what is more accurate and what is not trustworthy out of the partisan news sources. Partisanship and poorer quality journalism are necessary consequences of a free press, which do not hinder the entire mainstream mass media from being a mirror to reality. Partiality was in fact the norm before objectivity became an ideal in the early 20th century. Now, distrust of the traditional press that purports to be neutral is an issue that must be addressed for it to continue to play its role effectively. But once we look at the bigger picture, we can see that this pothole in the road of mirroring reality is symptomatic of the larger problem of the fourth estate, objectivity itself. Objectivity did not become a standard to strive towards until the 4th century of the European press. Historical periods experience heightened tension, and this is reflected in the media and the public. We can point out these periods, and in doing so, we can see that they are in fact periods, and as such, necessarily temporary, which consequently cannot damn the mainstream mass media. If anything, they rejuvenate efforts of the mainstream mass media to respect their pillar of objectivity. For example, Republicans in the friction-filled and disenchanted atmosphere of the United States in the 1960s began to see potential liberal bias of news reporters, as reports began to analyze the actions of corporations and of the president. As the decade wore on, journalists saw the danger in the increasing partisanship and even radicalism of the mainstream mass media, and consciously attempted to stick by the ideal of objectivity. Similarly, with our day and age, the sheer number of journalists' articles addressing this recent criticism of the mainstream mass media also point to a group of people which is aware of institutional flaws and is eager to change them, and to return more faithfully to the principles of journalism which have developed. Even more importantly, in practice, the mainstream mass media is the only area of media that can and does carry out the primary informative role in our society. Those for the motion might argue that the accessibility of journalism and online blogs to everyone with the internet and an idea has lowered the barriers of entry to journalism, and that this is breaking the dominance of journalism by established figures in the press. Social media is also a new and important form of political discussion for all levels of society. It might be true that new forms of media are giving people more chances for direct and public political engagement, but this is overcome by the fact that the mainstream mass media is the only kind of media that can report on certain matters, namely those of national significance. In the 20th century especially, the mainstream mass media became instrumental in exposing the abuses of corporations and governments, and it still carries this mantle. For example, it was a whistleblower that recently informed The Observer of the role of Cambridge Analytica in illicitly using personal data in order to make political ads specifically targeted at the electorate. Just as the New York Times published the Pentagon Papers disclosing information about the US in Vietnam, and the Washington Post investigated Watergate. Far from being in decline, the Fourth Estate is the only institution with the power to meaningfully receive classified yet controversial government and corporate information, and subsequently let the public know in a full and near objective way, therefore maintaining their role of holding figures with broad influence to account for their actions. The mainstream mass media is unique in this established role, and in the distribution resources it uses while it enacts such a role. Similarly, the mainstream mass media could only have had its day if it ceased to be the sole institution which could access international news to be distributed most widely to the public. But it is highly doubtful that the mainstream mass media can rescind this role in anywhere near the immediate future. It is highly unlikely, for example, that Kafui could stand in Syria as an independent journalist and report on it and make the same distributive impact as the BBC would. Moreover, the mass media can publicise grassroots phenomena like the Windrush scandal, which was properly brought to the public's attention when Paulette Wilson told her experiences to The Guardian in November 2017. The Fourth Estate is a mirror to everyone's reality. This, in turn, contributes to the mainstream mass media's position as the watchdog of power and defends the Fourth Estate against its charges of elitism in its coverage, while it may not defend it against elitism in its staff, which I am, in fact, willing to concede. Even personal everyday experience supports the notion that the power and access of the mainstream mass media is indispensable and unavoidable. All the people I've known who lament the diversity and objectivity of the media equally lament their compulsion to resort to the mainstream mass media to receive their news. There is only one way to conclude these considerations. Ephemeral and even more lasting institutional issues cannot break the influence and functions of the mainstream mass media in our society, even as new developments gain traction and attention. Whether we take fault with it or not, for good or for bad, the Fourth Estate and its power are here to stay. Gwendolyn Brooks put this fact in the following way. One reason that cats are happier than people is that they have no newspapers. Napoleon put it another way. I fear 3 newspapers more than 100,000 bayonets. The Fourth Estate, with all the questions and nuances surrounding it, with all its doubtful and disenchanted consumers, and with all its opinions and string-pulling moguls, struck fear even in Napoleon for a reason. The mainstream mass media is currently our best attempt at a mirror to reality, and this in itself is a reality we have to accept. Thank you.
That was awfully close in terms of timing. Now we have our proposition speaker, Mary Bonsu.
Everyone else has needed the stool, but I'm perfect height, so we're just gonna put that over there. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Mary Bonsu. I had the pleasure of seconding Professor John Kay on the motion of universal basic income last year, and that was a wonderful experience, so it's great to be back, and thank you for this great opportunity. When Kafui, our chairman for tonight, approached me with this motion, my first response was, well, I don't know. I'm not in the media industry. But then I thought about it a bit more. I thought about the fact that this motion is about me and my peers and why we choose to check Twitter instead of the newspaper, watch YouTube debates such as Grapevine instead of Newsnight, listen to underground podcasts such as The Receipts instead of listening to the radio, or opening up the Medium app instead of going to the BBC or The Guardian for our opinion pieces. The fact that we make these decisions each day is evidence in itself that the mainstream mass media has lost its relevance. But apparently, in a debate, you have to come up with actual substantial arguments. So let's get into it. I will be focusing on why the youth do not want to engage with the media, which is contributing to its decline, the decline in business, aka money, which we all love to talk about, and how social media has killed traditional forms of mainstream media. First of all, when I use the phrase mainstream media, I'm speaking of the traditional giant media corporations, the old boys, and old forms of media such as newspapers, television, and radio. So, to start off, mainstream media has had its day because it's completely out of touch with the moral compass of today's society. This is part of the reason why the mainstream media is not appealing to the youth. We don't have a lot of time, so I'm going to start with a world-class and well-respected publication, The Sun. So, as some of you may know, Katie Hopkins had a column in The Sun, and on the 17th of April 2015, she decided to write a piece on migrants in Calais who board trucks heading to Britain. And these are just some quotes from her opinion piece. Make no mistakes, these migrants are like cockroaches. The headline was, rescue boats, I'd use gunships to stop migrants. Some of our towns are festering sores plagued by the swarms of migrants and asylum seekers, shelling out benefits like monopoly money. No, I don't care. Show me pictures of coffins, show me bodies floating in the water, play violins and show me skinny people looking sad. I still do not care. And this was published by The Sun, a national newspaper. Now we have another well-respected publication, the Daily Mail. In 2017, they wrote a headline about Meghan Markle. Now that's upwardly mobile, how in 150 years Meghan Markle's family went from cotton slaves to royalty via freedom in the US Civil War, while her dad's ancestors included a maid at Windsor Castle. Of course, there are certain demographics who find this rhetoric acceptable. We can stand here and debate whether it's right or wrong to hold such an opinion. Of course, Katie Hopkins has a following. Of course, there are people who still read The Sun and the Daily Mail despite this rhetoric. But the fact that in this new age, this rhetoric is not attractive to many people. Young people nowadays care about the way we speak about people. We care about their humanity, and we care about morality. And this is what turns us away from traditional forms of mainstream media, because this is the reputation that they hold for themselves. This also speaks to the fact that mainstream mass media has its day, because when you get to the point where you have to degrade another person's humanity to create shock value just to attract some readers, you've already lost. Now, let's move on to how and why social media has killed traditional forms of mass media. Sites like Twitter and Medium and Facebook and YouTube offer a personal connection. They allow communities to connect, to engage in direct debate and discussion. In this society, people often feel disenfranchised, feel powerless, unable to stop things, to intervene, to be heard, because it's often the elite who hold the power of discourse, who control the media. What reflects our society's reality is society speaking up for itself, and we are able to do this through social media. We are able to do this through Twitter. Social media has created movements, has spoken for people, have given people the power to express themselves, to change the world, and this is something that we have not been able to do as individuals through the mainstream mass media. An example of the way the mainstream mass media has lost their power is Hillary Clinton's campaign. She had everything. She had all the traditional mainstream mass media backing her. She had the adverts, she had the campaigns, and she still lost. Now, examples of movements that have been created by social media, for example, is Black Lives Matter, the Me Too movement. We see right now that light is being brought to the situation in Sudan and Cameroon because of social media campaigns. This is not happening in mainstream mass media. Now, we see certain corporations trying to capitalize on this new age, this social media age. We see the BBC taking Channel 3 off the television and creating a YouTube channel in a desperate attempt to engage and connect with communities that they sit on the outside of. And it's ineffective because they are not the people expressing themselves. They are corporations coming in and trying to build off a culture that has been created by the people themselves and not these corporations. Now, in a world where everything is fast moving, where we get distracted easily, every 5 minutes there's a news story, things like newspapers just do not function in this society well enough. Now, my argument is not that they are not important, not that we shouldn't fight to preserve these traditional forms of media, but we have to be realistic with ourselves. We have to look at the way the media is moving and understand that it's just not as relevant as it used to be. And if you are a cynic and none of the effort I've made has convinced you, let's talk about money, numbers. So in 1974, the press had held 73% of the ad spend in the UK. This dropped below 30% in 2010. In 2018, the internet held more than 50% of that ad spend, and the press less than 8%. The internet took over radio in 2004, magazines in 2007, newspapers in 2009, and TV in 2011. As of 2015, 19% of all global ad spend flows through Google, Facebook, Baidu, Yahoo, and Microsoft. What this tells us is that more people are engaging with new age media than the traditional forms. It tells us that mass mainstream media has had its day, that it needs to be revived. Mass mainstream media has had its day because technology has caused my generation to move on. It does not have a future unless we reignite it. And the attempts to keep up have been desperate and ineffective. I implore you to think about the reality, to understand that yes, the newspaper is important. Yes, the BBC is so important for our society, but they are failing at their current role. They are failing to keep us engaged. They are failing to keep us informed because we are simply not using these modes of media anymore. Thank you very much.
Well, it appears the boxing gloves have come off. Thank you very much, Mary. Now, if there was ever any doubt that young people are the future, tonight should prove otherwise. It's the HLSI's policy to recruit seconders from local schools. Mary, Grace, and I all did this back in the day. And now we have two very talented sixth formers to do this for us. Yasmin Adams is a Year 12 student from the London Academy of Excellence, Tottenham. And representing St. Aloysius and the proposition, we have Kane the Antonis. Both our seconders will have 6 minutes to make their case. Whilst these are two extremely capable and talented individuals, I must remind you that they are still young and still at school. So, in a word, please be nice. Now, without further ado, our first seconder, Kane the Antonis.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Kane Antonis, and I must warn you, I have a bit of a tendency to stutter and for my voice to crack, so we'll see. Tonight, I will be seconding the motion that mass mainstream media has had its day. I'll be supporting this motion on the grounds that not enough of us in Britain today trust mainstream media, and that conversation on political issues has become so partisan that it has opened the doors for misinformation, populism, and the growth of so-called post-truth politics. This, together with the multitude of newly available sources of media found on the internet and on our phones, means mainstream media's significance diminishes day by day. To be clear, when referring to mainstream media, I mean conventional newspapers, television, and radio, the BBC, the Times, and the like. I would say the situation is much worse in the USA than the UK. But nevertheless, both here and across the pond, we are now turning to alternative media more than ever. For example, according to Ofcom, while TV is still the most used news platform, the internet is now more popular than both newspapers and radio as a source of media, not source of news. More significantly though, 4/5 of 16 to 24-year-olds use the internet as a source of news nowadays, while just 57% use TV. The media landscape is changing, and young people are spearheading that change. Personally, me and my friends all get our media from the internet. Not many of us would pick up a newspaper or even have radios anymore. We would rather choose our phones. Social media sites such as Reddit, Facebook, and Twitter are becoming hubs of information with a much larger scope of news sources than you could ever see amongst traditional media. That same Ofcom report named Facebook the third most popular news source in the UK, after only the BBC and the ITV. That's more than any single newspaper. The report also states that the numbers for websites like Facebook, like Twitter, are underreported due to the unconscious way we process much of their information. What's clear is that alternative sources of media are creating a whole new mainstream, especially amongst younger people. No doubt, the ease of access and sheer number of websites accessible at the click of a button has made this possible. This ability to pick and choose from such a wide variety of outlets has sadly not had the effect of widening discourse. Instead, the internet has become a breeding ground for populism and extreme partisanship, much to the detriment of mainstream media, which is being harassed by alternative news sources such as Breitbart and even, rather hypocritically, Fox News, who somehow sees itself as the embodiment of anti-establishment media. The effect this is having is that many people are embedding themselves within their own echo chambers, within websites like Facebook, and treat outside media with distrust and hate. The so-called fake news media are enemies of the people to many, and sadly, this is extending to journalism in general. A 2018 YouGov poll found that 77% of people either trusted journalists not much or not at all, a worrying trend. Furthermore, according to Cizion's State of the Media report for 2019, a poll of 2,000 journalists found that the biggest challenges facing journalists today, when barring staffing and resources, was social media bypassing traditional media and the ongoing conversation on fake news. Yet the main issue now that we witness every day is that the sort of populist rhetoric that helped fuel the rise of UKIP is now seeping itself from the dark corners of the internet into our mainstream conversation. Infamous YouTuber Carl Benjamin, renowned for his controversial statements, even ran as an MEP for UKIP in the recent European election. This rhetoric is what is helping create huge distrust in our mainstream media and is contributing to a coarsening of our public discourse. Media coverage around Brexit is the best example of what I mean. The agents of Project Fear versus the £350 million a week. A study by King's College described the coverage as acrimonious and divisive, and it's not at all hard to see why. All of what I have mentioned has helped us go down the rabbit hole where we, as the British people, no longer trust our media, and in many cases, no longer feel represented by it. According to the Reuters Digital News Report for 2019, as little as 40% of the public trust the news, compared to over 50% back in 2015. The report also states that brands like the BBC are seen to be pushing or suppressing agendas, especially over Brexit. Meanwhile, according to the Edelman Trust Barometer, over half of Britons, 55%, said that their views were not represented in the media. We can see why many people find a getaway in the internet. This is key. We may say the mainstream media is a pillar of our society, a pillar of Britishness, but how can we say so when the British public itself no longer trusts the media or feels represented by it? Rebuilding trust is one thing, but rebuilding trust against the backdrop of the internet, which helped enable the divisive rhetoric we see today, while also presenting itself as a readily available alternative to mainstream media, seems a hard task. We can all agree that Brexit may be a major reason for this, but this trend is global. As Mary mentioned, and as I mentioned earlier about the US, they are feeling the brunt of the decline of mainstream media. However, we all know the saying, trust takes years to build, seconds to break, and forever to repair. Youth today are not turning to the papers or the radio anymore. We're turning to our smartphones and laptops. Meanwhile, those susceptible to populism attack the mainstream media and turn to the internet as their only source of information. The future does not look bright for mainstream media. The internet has too far muddied the waters. To me, and to much of the public, mainstream media has had its day. That does not mean the decline is terminal. But for the mainstream media, they will never reach the heights of popularity, trust, and most importantly, significance that they once did. Thank you, everyone.
That was Kane the Antonis for the proposition, yes. And now we have Yasmin Adams for the proposition.
India, April 2018. A series of mob lynchings have seen at least 18 people dead, with many media outlets placing the figure higher. The cause? A heavily edited clip circulated on the group messaging site WhatsApp, claiming to depict the kidnapping of children amongst the alleged arrival of organ traffickers and sexual predators to the region. Among those dead, a government official, tasked with raising awareness not only for this case, but for the increasingly prevalent issue of fake news. Though scenes like this are thankfully all too rare, it is symbolic of the post-truth era we now all reside in. An era where the amount of content is vast and superfluous, where every individual with a smartphone and an internet connection can create and widely disseminate information, however accurate, faster than ever before. An era in which the role of the traditional media as an arbiter between fact and fiction is now more crucial than ever. Journalists are our gateway to truth. Whilst newsrooms and newspapers have entered a period of decline amongst the rise in digital media, the importance of journalism has only increased exponentially. In an age where key government officials are all too happy to manipulate the truth, both home and abroad are all too happy to manipulate the truth, be it pretend caravans of immigrants crossing borders or the £350 million of extra funding to the NHS, journalists are our passport to truth. They not only scrutinise, but hold governments to account for misinformation, allowing us, the people, to remain informed. However, the recent increase in cynicism within our society, triggered by the growing tolerance towards fake news, has arguably resulted in a lack of trust in our modern-day media, with many claiming that this will only exacerbate the decline in the traditional media. However, what many fail to realise is that the news is still overwhelmingly the source for factual information, with 41% of people, according to the 2017 digital news report from the Reuters Institute, agreeing that the news media did a good job in helping them distinguish between fact and fiction. The figure for social media? A mere 18%. That figure to most isn't surprising. In an age of Russian electoral interference, how many of you can truly say you believe everything you read on Facebook? Journalism is still thriving and will continue to thrive in the foreseeable future. The health of our journalism is intrinsically linked to the health of our democracy. Whilst young people are credited with a decline in TV viewership and the decline in newspaper readership, even amongst this demographic, the media still plays a key role in informing political opinion and influencing voting behaviour. According to figures from a recent YouGov poll, 60% of individuals stated that they get their political news from the BBC. 45% also get their political news from a newspaper, with The Guardian and the Daily Mail being the most popular. By contrast, only 15% said they get their political news from Facebook, 8% from Twitter, and 4% from BuzzFeed. Though the latter sources are much more popular amongst youngsters, 18 to 24-year-olds. Even amongst this demographic, traditional news remains the most popular political source. What we often forget when discussing the role of traditional media in modern-day society is that traditional media is constantly evolving, with many news and TV channels now placing an increasingly large amount of their content online, be it the constant chilling ring of a BBC notification on your phone, informing you of the latest developments on the absolute mess that is Brexit, or the latest BBC One drama that you want to rewatch on iPlayer. Traditional media is now more present than ever. Its ability to start a national conversation is unparalleled. Despite the fact that many initial conversations are started on the internet, be it the latest blunder of President Trump, who alarmingly is unable to use spell check in order to differentiate between a whale and an illegitimate human being, or commentary about the escalating situation in Sudan, it still remains true that a front page in the Daily Mail or a lead story in the 10 o'clock news means that this same piece of information is pretty universally assimilated in the public's understanding within a matter of hours. With its wide reach and ability to impact the public opinion, how can traditional media have had its day? The answer? It simply hasn't. Traditional media has simply not had its day. The rise in the prominence of new media from online video platforms such as YouTube to social media platforms such as Twitter has heralded an era where the true impact and influence of the traditional media is grossly understated. New research from Radio Centre and Ubiquity highlights the disconnect between the scale of investment pumped into online media and the value it delivers. It also reveals that key industry decision makers are significantly undervaluing traditional media. Few advertisers, according to the study, were positive about traditional media's ability to generate a return on investment. And yet, they yield the best overall returns after television, which in itself is still the most valuable. This disconnect is only made worse by the overestimation of the role of social media and online video. Whilst many advertisers believe that social media and online video came joint second with radio in terms of generating return on investment, online video is actually the 5th most effective at generating a return on investment, and paid social media, a shocking 7th. But times are changing. An increasingly large amount of companies are reverting back to traditional media in order to increase the reach of and trust in their brands. Despite the fact that there has been a reduction in the dominance of the 4 biggest US networks over the last several decades, with the emergence of a myriad of smaller channels, they still collectively commanded between $9.1 and $10.1 billion in ad commitments in the 2018 markets, according to Variety estimates, making it the 3rd consecutive year in which networks have secured an increased volume of ad revenue. If traditional media had truly had its day, it certainly is charging a premium for its final death throes. Overall, it is fundamentally incorrect to say that the mass mainstream media has had its day. To suggest that the mass mainstream media is painfully coughing at its deathbed, hanging on to the final strings of life in desperation, whilst it still plays such a monumental role in our modern-day society, is simply ludicrous. But I'll leave that for you to decide. Before I do, allow me to leave you with a question. Where is the defining line in which a form of traditional media is classed as having had its day? Thank you very much.
I'm now going to ask our main speakers to give their closing arguments and hopefully to reply to some of the points which were made from the audience. We started with Grace, so we're going to start with Mary this time. Take the stool.
Thank you. Okay, a lot to address. I actually agree with most of the points made, and that's because most of them didn't disagree with me. The motion is that the mainstream mass media has had its day. It's not that the alternative is any better, that people arguing over Twitter or going to Twitter to find their news is a positive thing, or that watching videos on Facebook to become informed is a worthy and reliable source of news. No, that is not my argument. My argument is that it is what is happening. It is our reality today. That people do not look to the BBC first. They do not look to The Guardian. We check Twitter for the news. We check Facebook for the news. We check BuzzFeed for the news. We go onto YouTube and we type in things to inform ourselves about the debate going on. We don't look to Newsnight. That is our reality. So actually, I agree with a lot of you. It is very dangerous. Fake news is a real thing on the internet. There's no gatekeeper on Facebook, for example. I do agree with that. But Facebook is a form of expression for a lot of people. It is a way to express their political opinions and engage with politics in direct debate and discussion. Now, I agree with the young lady at the back that it's important that we incorporate the two, that newspapers and traditional forms of media are very important, and we do need to preserve and safeguard them. However, publications such as the BBC have tried, and they are failing. The BBC Three YouTube channel is not thriving because they cannot engage with the communities that they are trying to target. Now, I think the division between old and new media is relevant because it's the motion. We are arguing here that mainstream mass media has had its day, that it's no longer relevant. And I think that there's a trend going on right now where you see publications such as The Guardian, such as The Independent, following the trends that they see on Twitter. They look to Instagram accounts such as I'm Just Bait to get their news, to pull in the audience. They don't create trends themselves, but they look to the internet to see what people are thinking, to see what people are debating, and then they write their pieces on them. A point was made that on social media, media moguls are dominating the space on social media. That is simply not the truth. What you see on websites such as Twitter is bloggers such as The Slump Hour, podcasts such as Three Shots, websites such as The Receipts, they are the ones that are thriving. They are the ones with thousands of followers. Influencers were brought up. If mainstream mass media was doing its job, the job of influencers on Instagram would not exist. Companies and brands are now turning to individuals who have millions of followers on Instagram to sell their products rather than magazines. This is evidence of the fact that mainstream media is in decline. And this idea of the truth being very important was brought up. And yes, of course, the truth is very important. But in the day and age that we live in, nobody cares about the truth when the lie is more entertaining. And we can see that happening on a day-to-day basis. And yes, that is not a positive thing. It's a negative thing that needs to be eradicated from our society. But as I say again, this is our reality. And if we want to debate on the solutions or on how we can preserve and safeguard our traditional forms of media, I will be happy to return. But that is not the question at hand today. The question at hand today is whether mainstream mass media has its day. And I implore you to be realistic about the state of mainstream mass media. And the only answer to that question is yes. Thank you very much.
Well, Mary will be happy to have you back, but for now we have Grace Volante to give her closing argument. Grace, over to you.
I anticipated that Mary would be difficult to argue against, and that was not wrong. So I agree with Mary in that the audience are on the right track to be concerned that the societal functions of the mainstream mass media are something that we need to maintain. I'm also of Mary's opinion that new media give the public its own platform, and it is a grassroots phenomenon. But the mainstream mass media, unfortunately, it's our first port of call if we want to know about communities we are not a part of, what's going on anywhere except outside, the UK, and also with the government. Unfortunately, this is the case. I'd like to respond to Mary and Kane, where they say that, some do not trust the current mainstream mass media and engage with it less. I think that the statistics they used were prevalent and they were worrying, and they support Mary's point that engagement is declining. But as an institution, the mainstream mass media is like the government. You can take our current government as a very good example of how. So a lot of people think Theresa May and her cabinet have done an awful job. A lot of people think she is an awful prime minister. That doesn't mean there won't be a prime minister in the next election. It just means that people are dissatisfied with how the prime minister is doing currently. I am not quite sure that newer forms of media are in the position to take over what the mainstream mass media has built up for itself. And that's the main point that I would like to hammer home. I have a quotation from John F. Kennedy, which describes the press as the recorder of man's deeds, the keeper of his conscience, and the carrier of his news. And this being the case, I think despite the communities that Twitter can build, despite everything that the proposition has said, we would need a revolution in media for the mainstream mass media to have had its day, because newer media would need to definitively oust the mainstream mass media in its position to access certain forms of news. And whether we like it or not, this is our reality. I also think that the points that Kane emphasized about people being disenchanted with the mainstream mass media are symptomatic of people having mistrust in society. We have seen a lot since the press has emerged. It's had a roller coaster ride of history. That doesn't mean that because people are turning to newer forms of media now, that they won't have to return to it in the future, and that the new generation, as Mary has described, won't take it upon themselves to rejuvenate the mainstream mass media. As with all components of society, the conduct of the mainstream mass media will be criticised, especially in a tense climate. But I also agree with Yasmin that when the mainstream mass media has had its death throes, we won't need a debate about it. Its death throes will be unmistakable, and no one would be sitting up here. Thank you.
Well, 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 we've come to the end of the first ever Highgate Student debates. And what a spectacle it's been. Let's go on. At the start, we checked to see who agreed and who disagreed, and it seemed that the proposition had quite the fight waiting for it. So now I'd like to see if they've managed to change any minds. All those who agree with the motion that this House believes that the mainstream mass media has had its day, please raise your hands and say aye. A bit louder than that, please.
My dad's vote.
It's a nice increase for the proposition. And those who disagree with the motion, please raise your hands and say nay. Well, the nays have it. The nays have it. Well, thank you very much to all of our speakers, and thank all of you for missing the leadership debate to join us here today. Mary, Grace, Yasmin, Kane, both I and the institution are forever in your debt. I now invite Robert Lloyd to wherever. Oh, there he is, Robert. Okay.
Well, I must say I'm absolutely thrilled and proud that this institution is taking this sort of care of young people and sponsoring and encouraging such young talent. I think it's just wonderful. I hope you agree. This debate was by way of being an experiment to see if it would work. I think it did, and I think we might do it again. We might even have some of the same people again, you never know. It's my job to thank everybody most profoundly. Can I give these little keepsakes? Kane, it's a book curtain and a booklet for you to stick in the book that you buy with it. Yasmin the same. It's a voucher to spend as you will. Mary, the same.
Thank you very much.
Kafui we owe a lot to for all sorts of things which some of you won't know anything about, but we do. And so we've decided to give him a special honour. He's going to become an honorary member of the HLSI for 2 years. And I want to thank you too for coming this evening. This evening of all evenings, when you could have been at home boosting Boris's ego. In fact, now we'd like you to go next door and have a glass of wine. I have to tell you, however, we can't serve anybody under 18. That actually might not include anybody here, looking around. But anyway, do take care of that, because we have to be careful of our license.